Okay, welcome back. And we've got Professor Colby to please continue.
Audio off. Okay, thank you. I'll share my screen again. Okay, so I talked about 3 options for developing weights using disability categories. There is a 4th option, and that would be for the state to develop a needs-based framework for assigning weights that does not rely on disability classification. There are some states who have done that. There's no standard approach that states have done that, though. And sort of how they think about needs, some states tie it to the percentage of time a student spends in general education. However, under federal law, that creates an opportunity to run afoul of IDEA if it's not monitored carefully, because you cannot tie dollars to placement. But if the state wanted to do that, you would have to invest in developing a different set of measures that for student need and develop cost estimates for that. That is not a small undertaking, right? Because we have to build this from the ground up for students. And the other point I would make is that, and this just comes from our experience on the national study, is that while disability categories are an imprecise proxy for student cost and need, we also don't have any evidence to suggest that need-based weights are more efficient or equitable than weights that are based on disability categories. So we don't actually know at this time. So I just want to make, I hope you all know that I try to be sort of balanced about these things. So you have a couple options that you can use for disability category. If you don't go that way, you're going to have to develop an independent needs-based framework in Vermont. That is a pretty extensive exercise to do and probably a pretty costly study to do. And I'll just be honest, I'm not sure that you would get a lot of mileage out of that, because we don't know, at least right now, that doing something based, like, for example, the cost-based tiers, like low, medium, and high cost disability groupings, there's no real evidence to suggest that they are any more precise or imprecise than if you do something that's based on some other criteria. There are 4 additional design conditions. Well, there are probably a lot more, but there are 4 additional design considerations that we just wanted to bring up. And so now I'm going to pull back out of the parking lot the transportation issue. I did write down in the parking lot. I'm going to talk about tuition students. I want to talk briefly about CTE, and then I want to talk about adjusting the base spending amount. And again, there may be additional design consideration, but these were 4 that were directly related to our calculations for the base and the weights. So the first one is policymakers are going to need to decide whether to continue your current transportation grant funding program, or if you're going to include some other cost adjustment within this new student-based funding formula. So right now you're essentially run outside the formula through this categorical program. You could try to do something within the formula, but that's going to be, I'll just be honest, it's going to be really tricky. It's going to be really tricky because not all districts provide transportation, and the transportation costs vary quite a bit across the state with regard to, how many miles, how many students. And so it makes it really difficult to come up with what would be sort of a fair transportation weight, or even a fair per pupil grant amount. Which is why, if you go back to historically, why we sort of have the funding program we have, which, is essentially a reimbursement program, so that it reimburses a fixed percentage of transportation costs. Right now, transportation spending paid for by the state's existing grant program is not in the base, right? It would come out of the base. Second thing you have to think about.
Dr. Colby,
yeah,
before you go on, because the state has a 50% grant, so is the 50% spending by the school districts in the base right now?
It is.
Okay.
It is. But the categorical grant is pulled out. And in the memo that accompanies this, we're very specific about what's in and out of the base.
Okay, thank you.
Second issue, and I sort of hinted at this last time I came before you, is I think Vermont has some unique contextual factors with regard to our school choice programs. And we are going to have to make some decisions in the context of a student-based funding formula about sort of how that all works. Okay. And so the big decision we have to make is, how are we going to apply this base spending amount and weights to students for whom a town or unified school district pays tuition, right? And to either attend another public school or an approved independent school. And I'm just going to call them tuitioned students. My grammar check on my computer tells me that tuitioned is not a real word, but I'm going to make it up and call them tuition students. So there are two key considerations here. And again, there may be more, but we are highlighting conditions that are directly relevant to how the updated estimates we developed are used. Okay, so I just want to be clear about the lane in which I'm working here. Okay. So with that lens, there are two things we got to think about. And that is whether towns will be allowed to pay tuition amounts that are different from the base spending amount. This question also applies to the question around excess spending that you talked about too. Okay, so, but I just want to talk about it for now in terms of sort of towns that are tuitioning all or most of their students. Second thing we have to talk about is how formula weights will be applied to tuition students. And I want to break these two things down separately. So let's take on this first question, whether towns will be allowed to spend more than the base. And again, I'm staying within the lane of the analyses that we have provided you, okay? And the underlying assumptions for how a student-based funding formula works. And so let's start with that assumption. The first assumption of a student-based funding formula is that unlike sort of what we have now, where people pick budgets and we do tax capacity weights, no. Well, when we move to a student-based funding formula, this presumes that the base spending amount is uniformly applied to all students in the state, right? So every student is $15,033. That is the amount of right? That's the adequate spending amount for a student to attain sort of common performance standards. And we have to have that common spending amount, right, to meet the state's constitutional obligations, right, to ensure equal educational opportunities, right, and sort of and our adequacy requirements, right, with respect to funding, but also fiscal equity, right? So it can't be that we have a situation where, and again, this comes up for public school districts too, and under the excess costs, it's kind of the same logic, right? We can't have a situation where we have a base of 15, I'm going to round numbers, 15,000, right? And then that's what we're spending for students who are not tuition students, right? And then we have a number that's, I'm going to make up a huge number just for contrast, like 30,000, right? For students who are attending different kinds of schools, right? Especially if those dollars, right, are buying additional amenities and programs of study and things along those lines that are different from what the students, right, what the $15,000 are buying for the students who go to the schools that are held to the 15,000. Okay. You run into all kinds of constitutional issues here. So a key issue to decide is giving the state's obligations, right? And the fact we have a base spending amount that is 15,000, right? A key consideration is going to be whether towns can pay tuition amounts that are different from the base spending amounts. And if so, under what circumstances? And if towns are allowed to pay a different tuition amount, a related consideration is going to be whether towns are limited in the amount they can spend per student above the base. And again, this is kind of like the excess spending discussion that you have to have for students who don't attend, who are non-tuition students. So it's the same kinds of questions, but it becomes a little trickier in the context of our current policy environment where we have approved tuition rates and things along those lines, right? So those two pieces of our policy framework are going to have to get reconciled under a student-based funding formula. Did I hear
So
that?
do you have another slide on tuition, or
I
should we
do.
just?
No, I do. No, I do. I just didn't. I thought I heard somebody ask a question. Okay. The second thing is that how will the formula weights be applied to tuition students, right? And so I want to be clear about how the weights that you've seen in this presentation and that are in our memo can be applied. Okay. So the student need weights can be equally applied to tuition students if the formula sets the base spending amount equal to the approved tuition amount. Remember, the weights have to be on the same base. The school context weights can be equally applied to students who attend public schools. We can't, the school context weights can't be applied to tuition students who attend non-public schools because they were not included in our analysis. We can't include them in our analysis because we don't have outcome data for those students. And the third thing is that student need and context weights can only be applied to that base spending amount. Right? It's kind of like our variable base question that we talked about a minute ago, right? Like we have to have a common base for those weights to apply. If you don't have a common base, then we have to think about like how we do weights differently. So let me just stop there. Those are some design considerations. Like those are pieces of sort of our existing policy landscape that have to get reconciled with sort of a new funding model that going forward. And there may be other questions around tuition students. Again, I want to stay within the context of sort of what we've done in our analysis and the questions we've been asked to consider.
So Professor Colby, just a couple of questions on tuition. So because if someone was to, the school district, because in this context, it should be districts, not towns, right? Theoretically, if we move to a different.
That's right. Yeah.
All right, yep. So in that context, if a student cannot attend the school for their age group because the school district didn't have it, maybe it's a public school that's across the border of the state because it's more convenient. Let's take Southern Vermont just as an example. So you're saying in this context of the tuition that school charges, our concept before, my thinking was that according to the calculation of what that student's formula would result in, the 15,000 plus the base if they're English language learner or coming from poverty, then that is the amount that they would be able to take to that new school.
That's correct. That's correct.
All as a student.
Yes.
And then you're saying that wouldn't be the same, you couldn't apply that to an independent school.
You could apply that to an independent school,
Okay.
right? The issue is that we can't, the state cannot, the base spending amount, right, is what's been determined to be the adequate amount of spending for a student to achieve a certain set of outcomes. And so the state's going to say our obligation is $15,000. Okay.
Yeah.
Your obligation for some students can't be 30,000 and 15,000, right? Your obligation's 15,000.
Right. So I guess the question comes from a practical standpoint. If an independent school says, this is our tuition rate, and one student is at 15,033, but then a different student is weighted at 25, whatever, just take it for example, does the independent school have the ability to say, we'll take Johnny, but not Susie, because Susie gets
Well,
the
under
extra
current state board rules, they don't, right? Approved independent schools cannot discriminate.
but they also can charge what they can charge in this
Well,
town.
this is why I'm
Okay.
raising it. So this is
Yeah.
this is a design consideration, right? And so, you know, you could imagine a world in which you could imagine a world in which that the 15,000 follows a student, and if there are additional needs, the cost adjustments follow the student too, right? So remember, I said that the student need weight space can be applied to the 15. So if you were an independent school, right, and you accepted and enrolled a student who's experiences economic disadvantage, then you also should be entitled to the base plus the cost adjustment, right? And my understanding now, and I would encourage you to talk to independent schools, but my understanding from, right, is that right now, independent schools peg their tuition at some sort of average, right, which takes into account this variability. So all this would be is being this wouldn't really change that, right? Because, I mean, they're already coming up with an average tuition. What this is actually more precise, right? It means that they would actually get the additional dollars to provide the additional services to a student with additional needs. But from an equity standpoint, right, we can't have sort of two systems going on at the same time, right? Once you say that 15,000 is the adequate spending amount for a student to attain outcomes, and that has to be the common base for everybody. All students. This is not by school. All students. And if you say that the cost adjustments that go on that base, so the additional spending necessary for an English learner, right? Then that cost adjustment goes with that child, no matter where they go to school as well, right? You just have to treat like and like.
Yeah,
Where
and-
this gets challenging, and this is why we're raising it, is that it could be the case that the approved tuition amount looks different from your base, right? And we right now have a system where we have tax capacity weights, right, which are weighting sort of spending, but we're moving to a student base. If you move to a student-based funding formula, that we're going to a system where now we have to think about student weights, not tax capacity weights, which are offsetting total spending.
I agree with the approach. What I'm just trying to figure out is if the independent schools would have to accept those students, even if it's at a lower dollar amount. That's what I'm trying to figure out. Okay, sorry.
I don't understand.
So,
I think that's a
Yeah.
question for legislative council. I don't. I think that is we are raising it because of exactly that question, right? Like this is a policy issue that if you move to a student-based funding formula, that will have to get sorted out.
Yep.
And
Okay, so
we want to
question-
be really clear about how the numbers we've provided you can and cannot be used in that conversation. We're not recommending a specific approach to how to solve that. Okay.
questions are stacking up. I've got, before we start, I've got Feltus, Maslin, Holcomb, Odie. Representative Feltus.
Thank you. So if I understand that the student-based weights that we're talking about, just as Representative Kimball mentioned, so, and you had 500 students going to tuitioning 500 students someplace else.
Mhm.
100 of them are the $15,000 students.
Okay.
Another 100 of them are economically challenged, so it's 15 plus 15 and it's 30.
Yep.
Some of them need special education, and so we're going to put something on there. And a few of them need English language students. So you would take the number of students times their particular needs and say, okay, we're providing this amount of money for these students, this amount of money for these students, and they're all going to be tuitioned out. I think then Charlie's question is, well, I guess it's up to the school that would be receiving those students. Can they accept that mix of students in the student body and they have the resources available to accommodate all those students?
If I could reframe that statement, I think
Okay,
that
please.
under existing state board rules, the rules are, if you're in an independent school approved for public tuition, there are very clear guidelines around discrimination, right?
Yes, yes.
So I just want so how I might rephrase that, and this is, I think you're getting the crux of the issue, is it would be up to the independent school whether or not they would accept that dollar amount for that student.
Right. That's
Right. And so, but I think your example is really great because that calculation that you just did is the same calculation for students in public schools, right?
Right.
So, right, like, so the calculation has to be the same. Right, so you would
Correct.
do the exact same calculation you just went through if that child attended Montpelier,
Right.
right? I mean, of those 500 children were the children at Montpelier. So the only difference is that in places that tuition all or some of their students, right? You know, the example you gave would be sort of like that would be your total school budget. Now what you have to do is we have to assign dollars to a particular student, right? And those dollars are what follow a particular student. So the dollars for Tammy, who would be, you know, if I was economically disadvantaged, would be different than the dollars for Jay, my brother, who's not, or I don't know, can't say my brother because he'd be economic. Jay, this other child over here who wasn't economically disadvantaged, right? That's the only difference, but the calculation is the same.
Okay.
On a student basis. The challenge that we're raising is that you could have a disconnect between the dollars, right, that go with Tammy and the tuition amount that the school charges. And where we run into equity, sort of where we run into challenges under the Equal Protection Clause is if we provide more funding, right, on a student basis for a child who goes to a private or an independent school, right, than a child who goes to a public school who's being held to these very specific base spending amount and very specific cost adjustments. That's where this gets very tricky under the Equal Protection Clause.
Right.
Okay.
And I also understand the distinction you made that if in an independent school, there were other services that were offered to students that are not part of the basic education that we might talk about and might be reflected in the tuition amount, those would not be considered.
They can't be, right? Because then we wouldn't be providing equal educational opportunities.
I
right?
understand
We would have
that, yes.
amenities someplace in another place.
Okay,
So, again, there are a lot of what we just wanted to do is highlight how the numbers that we've calculated play into like this. These are decisions you have to make, and we just want to be clear about how our numbers and how that works. Okay.
Representative Maslin.
Yeah, Dr. Colby, what's been rattling around up here as we've been talking is a discussion question that came up when we were first talking about weights in this committee downstairs. Having to do, how do we know when the money goes where we say it goes? Because as we know, money's fungible.
Mhm.
Once a school district gets the I'm just gonna call it extra. The weighted money, additional above the base amount, and we think we know where it goes because we've specified in effect, so much for this, so much for that. What assurances do we have that the money is actually spent where it's intended to go, or the General Assembly thinks it ought to go? And I don't know if there's an easy answer to that, but it is a consideration for us to kind of ponder.
So the funding formula can never really deal with that, right? Unless we have an outcomes-based funding formula, and we can't do that, right? Like that's not allowed. We do in higher ed, but not K-12. So we have to rely on other things, right? When it comes to sort of monitoring how it is that and holding districts accountable for their educational programs, right? And for student outcomes.
Yeah.
And that's where we have the district quality standards, which are in rural. We have the education quality standards in rural. We have special education rules, right? Like those, the funding formula can't do those things, right? We have to make sure that we have strong rules around how it is that districts and schools operate and the educational programs that are in those schools, just in general, and for students with extraordinary needs. And then we have to have an agency that is clearly monitoring and holding districts and schools accountable for meeting those standards. And when they're not, providing them technical assistance and the supports they need to bring that around, right? But the funding formula can't handle, like, money's a means, not an ends, right? So we can't, those are really valid concerns, but they are not things that we can handle in the funding formula. We do have other tools in our toolkit already in the state to do that. And we have an agency whose job is to monitor and make sure that those rules are being implemented.
Thank you, makes sense.
Representative Holcomb.
Yeah, thank you very much. I want to go back to something you said. I mean, and first of all, I think I appreciate this, and I think this would benefit districts, public schools. It would also benefit private schools that are serving a disproportionate number of students who are disadvantaged, like Linden Institute. You have been very careful in how you're talking about this. You said the rules prohibit discrimination, but discrimination is not the same as open enrollment. And Vermont has not been able to enforce its discrimination statutes in some of our current schools. And some of our schools have elaborate application procedures. They have fundraising requirements. They have a bunch of other things that gate enrollment. And so I think there's only 2 independent schools I'm aware of that have committed to open enrollment, and they're Thetford Academy and the Sharon Academy. I think your rules may not allow discrimination, but they do allow conditioning of enrollment. I think what I'm seeing here is that this might reduce some of the incentive to condition enrollment, because right now, from the agency's data, a disproportionate number of tuition students are actually who are economically disadvantaged are going to public schools, but they're not getting the additional weights to support the education of those students, you might see that the tuition students were more equitably distributed across the system if there was appropriate support behind students. I think that's where this is going.
I don't have those data, Representative Holcomb, so I can't speak to that. Let me go back to the rules, right? Like, so I think if there are concerns under the rules, and those are things that need to get brought up with the state board with respect to, and the agency with respect to the rules, right? Like, so, I mean, I can talk about the funding formula here. And so I don't have the data about the percentage of students who are economically disadvantaged who attend independent versus public schools. We don't have those data. And so I can't speak to what the distribution is, and I don't know what the incentive effects may or may not be for independent schools, right? If they were to receive a weight for an economically, if they were allowed to charge differential tuition, or if tuition amounts were pegged, right, to base spending amounts and these cost adjustments, I think that would be something that, I mean, it seems to me that you would want to take testimony on. We don't have that information. All I'm trying to do here is highlight how it is that the numbers we calculated can and cannot be used, and where it is that we've identified some potential friction between the policies as is and the policy that would be.
Representative Odie.
That's probably, maybe you said this already, but would the schools to which the students are tuition have to follow the same rules to get the same dollars, whether it's for the base or the weighted students?
I think the question you're asking is around sort of how the rules currently work for independent schools who are approved for public tuition. And, there are rules right now that are clear about the criteria that they have to meet. So maybe I'm misunderstanding your question. I mean, from a funding perspective, which is really what I can talk about here, there will be a base. If you move to a student-based funding formula, there will be a base funding amount. That base funding amount has to be common, regardless of where a child goes to school, and the cost adjustments have to be common, regardless of where a child goes to school.
But if I were to open a school and then start taking students and just didn't have any particular way that I was teaching anybody, but I took the students with their base grant and with the weights, I wouldn't have to follow any rules. I could just do that.
No, I think we have rules in the state that talk about what independent schools who are approved for public tuition have to do, right? And so, I mean, I'm not here to talk about those rules today. I'm here to talk about
All
the
right,
funding
but
formulas.
I guess I was
I mean, I
confused
think
to
that-
any school, but it's just to the approved independent schools.
Well, these are public dollars, right? And so
Right.
unless you're going to change policy somehow, right? Like, we're talking about the dollars that follow students, right, from places that don't operate a public school. So those dollars would need to go to an approved independent school.
So what about prep schools?
Again, this is all under sort of what's allowed under the rules. And so I'm not
you're
in
talking
a
about-
position to
okay.
talk about that. All I can do is talk about what the base funding amount is and what the weights are.
All right,
These are all valid questions to look at in terms of our existing rules for independent schools.
all right, thank you, thank you.
Okay.
Professor Coleman, we can move on.
Yep. Okay. Two more quick points.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Representative Felters.
I'm sorry, one more quick point. On the very first bullet point, back on that last
This
slide,
one? Okay.
yes. Student need-based weights could be equally applied to tuition students if the new formula sets the base spending amount equal to the approved tuition amount. I don't understand what you mean by approved. talking
This
about-
means that's the amount, right? What we're just saying is that the base spending amount has to be, you can't, the amount of dollars that can be spent for tuition for on average for a student, right? It needs to be equal to the base.
Right, the base plus the various weights we talked about.
That's right. That's right.
Given- That total amount would be the amount available for that student.
Yep.
Okay, to go, whether they went to an independent school or a public school.
Has to be same. Has to be
Right.
same.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Now we can-
I know that we know that career and technical education is a topic that's come up. We just want to be clear about how the analysis, no recommendations specifically, but we do want to be clear about 2 points, right? Is that the base spending amount here and the student weights do not apply to students who attend the state's career and technical education programs. Why is that? Because they have different cost structures and they were not included in our analysis. And the other point we just want to make is, that a matter of practice, most states' student-based funding formula do not include weights for students who attend CTE programs. My understanding that may be a policy proposal that's under consideration. And the reason they don't do that is because the base is different, right? The base cost would be different. So if you have a different base spending amount, or sort of the base cost per student is different in a public school versus a CTE program, then the weights would be different, right? Because the cost adjustments would be different. The last point I want to make is the base spending amount in a student-based funding formula has to be adjusted annually to reflect changes in education costs. And that can be, the changes in education costs could be just due to general inflation, but in particular, a key point that we have to keep in mind when we're dealing with base spending for education programs is the fact that the bulk of that spending is for personnel. And so we have to be attentive to when we're making changes, when we're doing those annual adjustments, to make sure that those annual adjustments are accurately reflecting, right, changes in employee compensation, wages and benefits. So states can develop and adopt their own employment cost indices. Wyoming's done that. I provide you in the memo that we provided, there's a footnote to how Wyoming did it. Lori Taylor, who's a very well-respected education economist, developed something for Wyoming. Or they can use a regional or national employment cost index. And this, I'm sort of coming full circle here, right? We used an employment cost index. And Rebecca, you asked this question, right? So we use the US Bureau of Labor Statistics Employee Cost Index to adjust to fiscal year 25. But I do want to point out that other places in Title 16 of Vermont statute calls for using the NYPA. Those two adjustments are really different in terms of what they consider, right, with sort of what it is that they're considering in their adjustments. We tend to recommend that states stick with an employment cost index of some sort. The BLS one's a decent one, right? There are others. In the memo, we provide some citations for others that states have considered. But either way, I think I really want to stress this point, is that the inflation index that you choose is incredibly consequential. Right? So if you choose an inflation index that doesn't map or track, right, with how costs are growing over time, then your base is not going to track with the actual costs that districts incur to provide an adequate education. And so, usually the problem is more that you underestimate than you overestimate, right? So like that, it's incredibly important. The other thing to remember is that those cost adjustments, although they might feel small on a per student basis, maybe they're different of $1,000. When you add that up across all students in the state, it's a big deal for when we start to think about like total education spending statewide. So the choice of your index is a consequential decision. And so we just want to highlight that again. We in our analyses used the ECI. There's also something called the Comparable Wage Index, which is published by the U.S. Department of Education, which looks just at teacher wages. There's a different kind of index that's used in the School Finance Indicator Project. So most indices that at least we have used and recommend to states to use are employment cost-related indices because they track more closely with changes in spending on personnel and wages than do general product indices like the NYPA. But we're flagging it because this is a really consequential decision, and it's not one to sort of be like, oh, we always use the NIPA, let's continue with the NIPA. Right? Like this one actually requires some thought, because getting that right will have a substantial impact on districts and your total spending amount. So I'll stop there. Those are all my slides.
Wait a minute, Representative Wazazik.
Thank you. In other points in the presentation, you've mentioned what other states do, and you're talking about suggesting using the employment
Mhm.
inflators. Do you know how many other states use that as opposed to a regional? Ish.
No, not off the top of my head. I
Okay.
can ask Lori if you want me to.
That would
I
be
know-
helpful.
I
Thank you,
know
'cause
that we just I just want to be clear, in our analyses, we used ECI because
Yeah.
it's very straightforward, and we felt like it was a fair adjustment given the changes in compensation employee benefits that we've seen over time. But I also want to be clear, there are others, right? And so it's just something, I think we're just raising it because we just don't want it to be one of those, we want to raise it because we really think it deserves conversation around like which ones you choose.
I follow up. I appreciate that. And I think that it would be helpful to have that information so that we could look at what other inflators other states are using, compare that to total spending, compare that to per pupil spending, compare that to educational outcomes, may help us guide how we build that in.
Okay, I can reach out to, I don't have that, but I can reach
Yeah,
out to
yeah,
my
if you could just send
colleague to
that when
see
you
if they have that. I don't know. Yeah, let me see what I can pull together for you.
Yep, thank you.
Representative Burkhart.
Professor Colby, does ECI include healthcare costs and like total employee costs, or is it focused mainly on wages?
It's compensation. However, I do remember from, I don't know, one of the times I testified before this committee, and I don't remember who brought it up. It was a question that was asked to me that said, could you have sort of an either or, right? Like you use the ECI or you compare the ECI compared to some health insurance premium, right? Inflator, right? I mean, the concern would be is that you don't want to choose an index that's under indexing, right? What's actually going on in the field going on. And so if you believe that health insurance costs, for example, are rising at a more rapid rate in Vermont than other places, you could have in policy, well, use the ECI, use the greater of the two or something along those lines, right? So is that helpful?
That is very helpful. It's not a follow-up, it's actually back to the slide before. Could you just say another word about how we would go about figuring out how to fund career technical education in a new governance structure? Because I think we're talking about potentially rolling CTE in terms of governance into our overall educational governance structure. And so how would you recommend we go about that project of determining how to fund it?
Yeah, I don't know much about the conversations around governance. I haven't been a part of those. What I can say is that, and I believe this might be underway, is that you need a cost study to establish the base, and then you need a cost study to figure out what the cost adjustments would be, right? Like you need to run if you're going to run a student-based funding formula for students who are not attending career and technical, then you need to run a student-based funding formula for students who are attending career and technical. But the inputs into that, like what your base is and what your cost adjustments are going to be different. And it could be, and I know some states take this into account, developing a base for CTE programs is hard because the base spending amount might vary by your technical or education program, right? And so those are the kinds of things that you would want to be considering when you develop a student-based funding formula for the CTEs.
Thank you.
Representative Odie.
Thank you. I'm glad you asked that because, Representative who's no longer here, and I spent quite a bit of time talking to different technical center directors around the state, and they, without knowing about weights, they were saying they needed more resources for certain kids. And so if we don't, I'm wondering there'll be disincentives to send a child to learn at the technical center if the supports aren't going along with them. Maybe they are going along with them. They do go along with them.
Yeah.
But would they go along with them for
I think-
EL?
Yeah, there are a couple of considerations,
do.
right? And I think this came up in our 2019 report, in the qualitative work. And, you know, when a child or when a student shifts from a traditional public high school, for example, to a CTE, to full-time or part-time over here, the FTE changes, right? And so you run into a situation where you can have districts public school district losing ADM, right? Over here, and a student-based funding formula, those counts of students matter, right? And so in theory, you might have an incentive, in fact, just like what you have with early college, right? It's the same issue, right? Like you're reducing you're reducing the dollars per student that are coming in. But we have to remember is that base, like all 15,000 of those dollars just don't go to Tammy. Some of those dollars go to lights and, you know, facilities and all of that. And so when this is one of the challenges with dollars follow students and choice programs, right? Is that if those dollars, right, once you don't have that student, then your economies of scale go down, right? And so regardless of what you do, you always have sort of this tension. And again, it's the same tension with early college, right? Where you've got students coming in and out. What I think you can lean into here is, and we just did a study on this in California and Texas, right? At the community, like this is the same challenge that we see in community college spaces too, right? When we do community college funding, is that like, what is a base spending amount for a student attending community college when you have all these different pathways, right? And you've got degree programs and non-degree programs and technical programs. And the reality is we have to start to think about what a base spending amount, we have to think about that differently, right? Because when we talk about public schools and we think about sort of a common general educational program, right? And then we're adding cost adjustments to that for students who need additional resources to pursue and excel in that program. But when we move over to CTE and we move over, or not the same thing in the community college space, right? Like we don't have a common educational program anymore. So then what is the base? And then what, right? And then, so that's where this gets tricky. And so in a student-based funding formula, a key consideration is going to be is, do you have one base? Do you have multiple bases? And then how do you put cost adjustments on top of that? And so the cost adjustments on top of that will depend on how you set up the base. So if you set up a base that's different for different pathways, right? And you say, well, the base for a healthcare pathway is this, but a base for this for an engineering pathway or is this, right? Then that's one thing you could do, just like you could, right? You're back to having a variable base. Or if you set a common base, now you're talking about, well, then you might have cost adjustments on that base that go with different pathways. It's the same building blocks as what we've gone through for sort of this general education curriculum where we have a common, but the same decisions have to be made over here for CTE. But the challenge we have to keep in mind is that we don't have a common educational program anymore. These are different, right? And we have to make sure that the spending number, that our funding numbers, right, both in the base and the cost adjustments, are reflecting that variation in educational programs and student need, right? Because we don't have to assume none of what we're talking about outside, like what we've been talking about today, outside special education, right? That all assumes a common educational program. CTE, we can't.
So, and committee, I just want to remind you, in the context of H 454, which we're working on, we're not going to be able to solve the CTE program in this session, but we should be focused on that and put accommodations in for next session to really come up with the detailed analysis, which Dr. Colby's talking about. It'd be unfair.
I think the key takeaway is, when you're thinking about that, I just want is to remember that in one area, we have a common educational program, and over in CT, we don't. And so like you get into sort of this variable base really fast. And it makes, right, and it just makes it makes it harder to develop a fair formula.
Thank you, Professor Colby.
Any remaining questions?
No. So, committee, we're going to shift gears.
Colby, thank you so much for everything. It's a lot of work and anticipated and worth the wait. So appreciate it.
And my understanding is that we did write a detailed memo to JFO that sort of provides lots more detail and assumptions. My understanding is that should be available to you shortly. So I'm happy to come up again and answer questions, and you all know how to find me. Feel free to email me if you have specifics as well. So thank you for your time. I appreciate the opportunity to contribute to the discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
so
Dan.
much. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Jeannie Albert. And so, yeah.
Say, it still is morning, so it is. Thank you so much. My name is Jeannie Albert, and thank you so much for this opportunity today. Thank you to each member of the committee. I really appreciate your thoughtful efforts. My name is Jeannie Albert. I serve as the chair of the Lincoln School District Board. I'm a lifelong educator and retired professor of mathematics, most recently at Middlebury. I'm testifying today on behalf of the Vermont Rural School Community Alliance, RSCA. The Alliance currently is supported by 78 towns across the state. Since January 15th, organizations that have joined include school districts, supervisory unions, union districts, select boards, and several early childhood and parent-teacher groups. New members are joining every week. RSCA advocates for the importance of rural community public schools and for a democratic voice in decision-making about their future. Our rapid expansion demonstrates that concern for the future of public education is alive and well in Vermont, and that folks in rural school districts across the state want their voices to be heard. The Alliance celebrates this expression of civic activity, especially in a time when strengthening democratic engagement is as important as ever. The written testimony that I submitted is longer than I'll be able to actually read. I didn't want anybody to be worried about that. I will highlight a number of items in here that connect to your work, especially around foundation formula, but around a couple of other issues that are important to our organization. Happy to answer any questions at any time. And if I don't get to something, happy to answer afterwards. We have three major points we want to make today. The first does concern several items about the foundation formula, and I'll return to that in just a moment. Our second point is that we urge continued use of the multi-district supervisory union governance model, especially in rural areas. And third, we encourage providing immediate tax relief to Vermonters, as well as comprehensive longer-term changes. But relative to the foundation formula, and some of what we'll touch on, even the end of the last testimony you were hearing from Professor Colby. Our first recommendation is that the development and design of the education payment must be grounded in robust research regarding both the potential benefits and known limitations of larger merged schools and districts. A recent report from University of Vermont professor Daniela Sutherland states, quote, "There is over 100 years of research on the outcomes of school and district consolidation, yet there is no empirical consensus that consolidation results in reduced educational costs in rural areas." And some of the reasons for that are projected savings that are offset by increased transportation costs, staff salaries, and infrastructure needs. Related to that is that determination of state payment must use Vermont-specific data, evidence, and community-based knowledge, and should respect the state's geography and democratic traditions. And based on initial review of some of what you've been discussing in terms of a state payment, we've seen that it appears to be going to be based on current state spending, and that's, I think, a good approach. We support that, but we also want to highlight Vermont-specific cost and spending data that's specifically about district and governance type and scale. And we included in the testimony some charts that summarize and provide a little analysis about spending data related to, say, the type of a district. So for example, at the K-12 operating district level, the merged multi-town school districts spend more per equalized pupil on average than other types of K-12 operating districts. There's a chart displaying that. We also looked at the supervisory union model and looked at spending in the merged multi-town supervisory districts. We're also tended to spend more per weighted pupil on average than other models. There's a chart displaying a very weak relationship between overall size of an SU and spending. And the last one I'll just mention, there's more information in, as I said, in the written testimony, that closing schools has not led to the cost savings that were initially anticipated. Spending per pupil in the examples we have here that are not atypical. The spending that was increasing in the district before, after the school closure continued, and in fact increased in some cases. So I want to be clear that just looking at spending by itself doesn't tell you everything you need to know, because I know I've heard in conversation with this committee, and it makes sense, there are maybe some districts that maybe should be spending more. It's not always about that one number, but that just highlights what we are trying to convey, which is these data show that a comprehensive study of Vermont schools and governance structures really is needed before designing an education payment that incorporates projected savings based on what could be erroneous assumptions around district structure, size, and cost. We also just make a quick note about implementation of a foundation formula, the benefits of including careful contingency planning so that uncertainties can be met appropriately. One of the ideas, and this also has been discussed in the committee, and one of them actually was you guys were just talking about a few minutes ago, but I'd heard testimony earlier having to do with a base payment inflator provision for costs such as healthcare that are rising much faster than average. We also noticed in some versions of drafts having transition parameters versus date certain, so that the next steps take place only after certain other provisions have been met, and that seemed like a careful way to do it. And finally, with respect to the foundation formula, it must be crafted with a full commitment to meeting the requirements of Brigham, again, which is a big conversation in your committee. Moving to a new system will require sufficient evidence showing that the new structure will, as Brigham requires, ensure substantial equality of educational opportunity throughout Vermont. We're unable at this time to make a determination about the likelihood that the final foundation formula that emerges will meet the standard, but we are encouraged by what appears to be a more realistic approach than the governor's plan. That is prioritizing, for example, what is actually an ample data-determined base amount. We also have made some initial review of the provision allowing for supplemental spending. I know there's some discussion about the best term for it. Extra spending, I call it extra spending, but anyway, you can take that if you like it, but anyway, beyond the state payment. And of course, you know, I can see that there's a lot of attention paid to making sure that equity is preserved, where those types of that type of extra spending can lead to issues there. With respect to equity, we do want to highlight that school size should not be used as a primary determiner of educational opportunity. The research is clear that smaller schools can provide highly valuable and highly valued opportunities for students. And we do include in the written testimony some reference to research both about academic achievement and student engagement. But we did want to highlight, we acknowledge and share the goal of improved educational opportunity in Vermont. We believe that a state payment system has the potential to distribute resources more equitably. But at the same time, we recognize and celebrate that equity of educational opportunity does come in many forms, and that this diversity represents a strength of our small state. In particular, using the size of a school is not by itself a valid way to infer greater or lesser opportunity. Okay, I know I want to use your time well, so I'm going to move along, and we do have other points in here that I really invite you to look at. I'll just say briefly that our second point, that we urge continued use of the multi-district supervisory union governance model, is grounded in the fact, among other things, but it's really grounded in the fact that in rural areas where there's geographic distance issue and sparse population, sometimes other geographic features, it makes it impractical to move to a more consolidated model. We also highlight that it's more, gives community members more oversight of their local schools, and in general, again, highlighting the theme that participatory democracy is not just a valued tradition in rural Vermont, it's a functional and effective system that enhances public education. Again, more to say about that. And then finally, our last point is around providing immediate tax relief and enhancing tax fairness. We've also looked at some of the programs you've been grappling with, for example, the new homestead exemption program that would replace the property tax credit. And some of the promising elements there are that this construct does seem simpler to understand, which is important, very important. It appears this approach would remove the lag that is in the current system. The inclusion of more income categories may reduce impacts from tax cliffs. That's a little harder to fully, but I can appreciate that may be one of the goals. And also, as indicated by JFO analysis, your version appears to provide more relief than the governor's plan to Vermont taxpayers in the lowest income bands, and we do support that. I'll just highlight, there's other items here. Again, it connects to what you were just talking about. So in terms of improving accountability and oversight, about making sure the money goes to where we want the resources to go. A state payment, it does appear to be more directly tied to per pupil spending and following the student, but we do still need, as Professor Colby was indicating, sufficient accountability and oversight structures. So those are our three main points. I want to close just with my final comment that we hope this information will help the committee set a thoughtful course informed by robust research and Vermont-specific data. We agree that improvements to the state's education funding system are needed, and we thank you for taking on this important challenge. However, in this moment, directly after a global pandemic and in the wake of federal disruptions and funding uncertainty, we caution against attempting too much change too quickly. Implementing a complete restructuring of the state's education funding system, while at the same time making large-scale changes to our governance structures, whose benefits are not supported by research or Vermont evidence, could further destabilize our education system and negatively impact students and communities. Thank you very much.
Representative Maslin.
Morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for being here.
Sure.
Couple of thoughts, and then I'll concentrate on one question area. You've combined an awful lot of different stuff in your testimony, and I appreciate that. And it's difficult in a room of just these people like parse out what to address first and what order. But I will ask about something that I've asked a number of people, including at least to the extent I was able to, Zoe Saunders and her staff, which has to do, let me see if I could set what seems to be the table early on. The governor and Zoe Saunders model proposal would, as you know, take hundreds of districts, and I'm going to use a deliberately sarcastic term, mash them into 5 districts. It proposes to save a whole lot of money. And it's in essence by eliminating a lot of teachers and a lot of administrators. At least that's what I think. But looking at the issue of school size, which you addressed pretty thoroughly. Some of us have been trying to figure out what the administrative structure is going to be that enables us to get from here to there, wherever there seems to be. You favor the multi-district supervisory union model now. And I appreciate that, but I'm still grappling with trying to understand who will it be that makes the decisions on which teachers go and which stay? What's the structure that enables us to do that? What's the structure that is going to enable us to set budgets within new areas, new geographically assigned, formed, whatever we want to call it, districts? Because really it comes down to who's going to make the decisions, it seems to me, if we're going to go forward. And I understand how a multi-district supervisory union model might work. But maybe you could elaborate somewhat on how that model will enable us to make the decisions that need to be made. Because we're not going to make them in this room. And I don't think they should be made in the agency. Right? A lot of this has to be determined by local people, or regional people. So tell me how this is going to work how do you put these things together?
I'm glad you started with an easy question for me. No, but it's a very serious question,
Yep.
but I don't want to pretend that I will be able to provide, a complete answer to that. It's a very important and challenging question. And I think what you mentioned towards the end of asking the question, I think is really key. And RSCA does advocate for having ways that different regions can have really direct input on those questions and what makes sense. Because partly the reason we bring up the supervisory union model is that it does really allow for more people to have direct involvement in those decisions. And they're hard decisions, and I know you've heard testimony, or various committees have heard testimony, or over the years have heard the challenges in making quote hard decisions. We recognize that. But I think the issue is if you try to make decisions which there will be conflict or differences of opinion around, or that will be hard in the sense of change being difficult at a minimum, but you don't involve the communities, even that's just only going to make it harder. So if there are decisions to be made, we really strongly believe that involving local communities in ways that help people understand what the options actually are, so they can really see why one direction is going to be better, or how to make things better, rather than just coming in and imposing something. I think that would really lead to a much more difficult situation. I'm not really, I'm afraid I'm probably not gonna
Well,
answer.
no, that's fine. I just want to add as a follow-up comment, I've been reading the list, Margaret McLean's list since it was formed. Usually don't participate, but I listen, and I found its development of this thought over time has been very helpful. But I think we all acknowledge we've got a ways to go. So that's my 10 cents.
Thank
Thank you.
Representative Holcomb?
Thank you for coming in and thank you for the thoughtful testimony. And I appreciate you talking about public engagement. I mean, we are at a moment of a crisis of democracy, and I want to own that people have that strong feeling, and it's important to not forget that. I have two questions. I mean, one is the SU structure. Most districts that are still in SUs are in SUs because of differences in different structure related to tuitioning. So it's not actually about democracy or small schools. It's about differences in whether they pay for vouchers or don't pay for vouchers. And that's a thing. And so I think that's kind of what we're trying to grapple with, because that's not about quality. It's about differences in how we deliver. And I don't think we know how to resolve that. The other one is you talked about Leithwood and Jancy, the 2007 study. They talk about small schools as schools of 300 is optimal for students who are economically disadvantaged, and 600 at the high school level. So 300 at the elementary, that's a small school in their universe, and 600 at the high school level. I want to know what you think small is, because the research on schools is not scaled to Vermont. And the same thing with some of the Duncombe work. They actually suggest that we could achieve quite significant savings consolidation. So what is small?
Well, I just with respect to the Leithwood and Jancy, I think one of the things that I just wanted to note is in my I found that very interesting, that their what they were looking at. And my recollection is that the 300 that you mentioned is not necessarily optimal, it's more the maximum. They say in there
For disadvantaged
disadvantaged.
kids, not for wealthy kids, but.
That's true.
disadvantaged kids. Yeah.
Right, but maximum means very different than optimal. It could, and it's hard
Too
to,
small. I guess what I'm getting at is there too small?
I would say, and yeah, not to quibble over that particular item, but I think the core item is if a school is, and this has come up, if a school is sustainable in its enrollment, even if it's small, if it, they use their resources well and the student achievement is good and other measures that we value, then I don't think the size is really important.
What if it costs $5,000 more to keep a kid in that setting and it's a predominantly wealthy community? Is that a cost that we can ask other districts to pay? I'm pushing on you because this is what we're grappling.
Well, I think that the question, that's why I said, why, if it's financially sustainable and that there's a fairness issue, I totally get that. Our current system, however, does in fact ask wealthier towns to kick in more, and they do. So that's not necessarily, to me, we've already accepted to some extent both that some student populations are more expensive or require more resources to educate, and we value them, so we do provide those resources. And then we also accept that towns have more resources, and so they also are in part of the system we have now, pay more. But we don't disagree I don't want to make it my personal opinion, but in general, RSCA accepts that there are schools where, say, the enrollment becomes sustainable, and that affects the finances as well. And we're just asking that in those situations, far in advance of when they would just be closed, that they're involved in the conversation, what can be done to move forward that's really best for kids.
Fair enough.
Representative Higley?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for coming in. I have one question and maybe a response, but the question is, I thought I heard you say that you consider the foundation formula based on current state spending. Did you say that?
And what I was referring to, I did, but if I said it in a way that was hard to understand, I'll clarify. What I was getting at is, my understanding is that the formula that you're working on, the idea, the state payment and starting the base payment, the weights and so on, that the initial formula would be based on current spending in Vermont. not like right out of the gate, what do we want it to be in a few years? That's what I was referring to.
Again, that's different than when we heard from Dr. Cole. I think the question was asked and answered twice. Basically, the answer was, the formula is a dollar amount the state has to spend to attain Vermont student standards and outcomes. So it's not based on the current spending.
Well, and again, I wouldn't want to get in the middle of that necessarily, except to say that I think in determining what that dollar amount is where it would be based on the current state versus an imagined future state. That was really all I was getting.
Yeah. Representative Higley, we can talk about that later too, because I asked that specific question of Dr. Colby, and she said the model is based on current spending in Vermont in order to what we need to spend to support those students. So the model is based on the actual
It's a
spending.
little different with the
Yeah.
wording that I wrote down.
Yeah.
And the second statement.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jim.
I just want to know, how much snow do you have in Lincoln this morning? How much snow did you have in Lincoln this morning?
Well, I can tell you last night I had snow in my yard, but this morning I had none.
Ah,
Because it rained all night. We had thunder showers and
Yeah, right.
spring is really here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Ryan Harity.
Good morning, committee members. For the record, my name is Ryan Harity, and I'm the superintendent of Lamoille South, which includes the towns of Elmore, Morristown, and Stowe. Today, I provide testimony on behalf of our schools and the Rural School Community Alliance, which represents over 75 towns and growing. This organization was formed to ensure that the rural voices of Vermont are heard and valued in decision-making. We appreciate your time and dedication to addressing the complex needs that exist in our system. As you know, our education funding formula is broken, and hardworking Vermonters are paying far more than their fair share. We support meaningful change to address these issues. For the past 4 years, I've been very fortunate to serve my rural communities as their superintendent. I also serve as a principal at the Elmore School, the last one-room schoolhouse in Vermont. I might be able to answer some of your questions, Rep. Holcomb, about a small school and that experience there. And I actually invite anybody in this room to come visit the Elmore School and just to see what it looks like. And
I second that.
my experience includes working as a teacher in a large high school with over 1,000 students. I've led several elementary and middle schools as a principal, including Union Elementary School right down the street, which is one of the largest elementary schools in the state of Vermont. I'm currently in the doctoral program at the University of Vermont, studying education, finance, and policy. And from direct experience, what I can tell you is that there's tremendous value in various approaches to education, and every child is unique. Today, I am here because I believe in the future of our beautiful state, a place my family has decided to raise our 3 children, ages 8, 12, and 14. As a father, superintendent, and proud Vermonter, I believe that we can all work together to fix our system and put our state back on track. Today, I hope to address 2 essential questions. First, what are the cost drivers that are leading to the increase in education spending? And second, is governance change required or advised to fix the funding system? Included in my testimony is a comprehensive slide deck. There's a lot of data in there. I invite you to check it out at your leisure. And it covers these topics in depth. But due to the limited time, I'm just going to summarize the key points. So first, the current crisis is a culmination of several key events. First, in 2018 was the passage of Act 173. This was intended to address the rising cost of special education. The state transitioned to a block grant instead of a reimbursement model, and the result was that some school districts lost significant funding. Changes in pupil weights were viewed by some as a way to alleviate that loss in revenue. In 2020, you might remember we had a pandemic. It resulted in students requiring extensive support in academics, behavior, and mental health. Schools were also provided with millions of dollars in one-time funds. In 2024, Act 127 budgets were developed, and this increased the size of the pie. In other words, we provided districts with more taxing capacity, which led to increases in spending. This spending when we look at the data, it really was tied to several areas. It was the combination of the legislation, which allowed districts to absorb some of those one-time funds, healthcare costs, the real increased need of students, and also capital improvements. The property tax impact, as we all know, resulted in 1/3 of budgets being defeated across the state. So the second focus, school consolidation. Will this solve the problem? Consolidating districts, we do not believe it's necessary. The education finance system can be redesigned without completely disrupting Vermont's governance structure. The research on district consolidation is highly concerning. Consolidating districts has led to increased expenditures, lower property values, lower average attendance, decreased parent engagement, more bureaucracy, decreased civic participation, and it also has been shown to negatively impact student achievement. From a practical standpoint, district consolidation is likely to increase property taxes. A preliminary analysis of Lamoille County indicates that consolidating Lamoille South, Lamoille North, and Orleans South, which would put us right around 4,000 students. We are also 3 SUs that send our students to the Green Mountain Tech Center. This would result, just preliminary data, in millions of dollars in increased spending, primarily related to the leveling up of contracts. That data is preliminary. And the other thing that I would like to add is that local residents have expressed strong opposition to any forced consolidation. And we do not believe any benefit would be gained for students and families. The final point that I'd like to make is that Vermont's size is our strength. And we can respond to this crisis or perceived crisis with a surgical approach. So we support the following, which is a multi-year plan designed to increase transparency and accountability. A foundation formula based on current districts, successful schools, and professional judgment panels. Protecting taxpayers with predictable increases based on inflation and local decision-making. In closing, I would like to thank you for your time and leave you with these thoughts. This week, we hired a high school teacher from a large district operating at scale in California. This teacher walked our hallways. He met our faculty. He said it felt like a family. He said he couldn't believe how welcoming his new colleagues were. He said it would never have happened in the school that he came from. When I asked him how many students he had in his typical class, he said on average 40. He said it was extremely hard to manage those students, to keep them engaged, and to provide them with a high quality education. This does not happen in Vermont schools. Every teacher knows every student. It's the reason we're a leader across the country. We attract many for a reputation that's about embracing an education designed to meet student needs, not designing a system that students must conform to. And just for reference, Lamoille County is 460 square miles. Boston is 48 square miles. We need an approach that's designed for a rural state that values community, democracy, and a high-quality education for every child. Instead of planning for failure, we need a vision filled with hope and optimism. Attracting families, growing our economy is how we will future-proof Vermont. Thank you for your time. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Chair's looking at me already. Again, thank you. And I appreciate that we are differently scaled and that makes a difference. And I appreciate you talking about how blowing up our system doesn't make this a place that young families want to move. And that is absolutely true. At the beginning of Act 46, we had a slide that made a lot of people super uncomfortable. And it showed for 2 separate districts, 2 separate high schools that both had per pupil spending at the time of $18,000 a kid. One of them had 300 kids and the other high school had only 85 or 90 kids. And the bigger school, even with the exact same per pupil spending, was able to offer 3 times as many different kinds of math, just math offerings. And the other school, if you went to that school, you would never get beyond Algebra 2 at that site on campus with a real person because they just didn't have the scale to offer that breadth of offering. What we're trying to negotiate is how do we right size, but also respect the fact that there's some fundamental realities around scale at the high school level in particular. You know, if you're at that second high school, I don't know that we're giving you equitable opportunities. You got the same fiscal backing. We're giving you the same fiscal equity, but you do not have the same opportunities. So I'm gonna ask you, what's the right scale, particularly at the high school level? I mean, how do we negotiate that?
I'm so glad you asked that
I
question.
figured you would be.
Right. Because what we're talking about is how we define quality,
Mhm.
right? And so if we take, my supervisory union, for example, where People's Academy has about, 220, but 240 students.
Mhm.
So if we look at what we offer in that school and we look at our spending is actually quite low compared to, statewide averages. But we wouldn't define quality based only on specific math opportunities, right? We would look at what is everything that students in that school get to experience, what are the relationships that they're developing, how do the parents rate the quality of the experience that they're having in that school, how do the students rate the quality that they're having in that school when they leave that school, what do they say about the experience that they had in that school, and what do they go on to do for jobs, right? And then when we're talking about trade-offs, so if we're talking about if we did decide to say, you know what, the school's too small and we need to consolidate and we need to, and we absolutely said, no schools below a certain amount. So it's, we picked 450 and sorry, you're 220, we're closing that school down. Then we got to say, okay, well, now what happens with those students? Where are those students going to go? Are we going to put them on a bus? Are we going to put them on a bus for an hour and a half each way and send them to a different school? Or we're going to put them on a bus for 45 minutes? What happens to their after-school activities? Are they going to participate in after-school activities? Are their parents going to be able to pick them up at that school that's an hour away? All of a sudden, we're looking at different sorts of trade-offs. So we're saying, maybe we don't have access to 4 different languages in our school, right? But our students, we have, I think at People's Academy, I think we have 90% of our students that participate, maybe even higher, in some sort of extracurricular activity. So when you think about that and you think about the value, there's a tremendous cost associated with that. And I don't think that when we're picking numbers or arbitrary numbers about school size in Vermont, we're taking all those factors into account. And I actually think that if we do that, or if we pick numbers like, 4,000 students for a district, or, or 300 or 500 per school, I think without thinking about our state, and that's why I put in the 460 square miles versus 48 square miles, without thinking about the topography and the distance that students would have to travel, and really how different parents and students define quality in their communities, then I don't think that that's fair. And I think it could cause tremendous damage for our students.
Representative Kimball.
Well, thank you. I won't ask you how much snow you have. But one of the things you touched on in the purview of the committee is the foundation formula. So from a supervisory perspective and for a budgeting perspective, if you're looking at the process you currently go through and the many iterations of how many pupils do you have, what's the yield, that kind of stuff, how, from a management standpoint, how do you view a foundation formula versus what we're currently doing?
I think it really depends on the money, right? And as Dr. Colby was presenting those weights, I was quickly running numbers to say, okay, well, what would this look like in my current SU? And I was looking at one of my districts, I think just, preliminary numbers, we would lose millions of dollars. And then in another district, we might gain $5 to $9 million. And then so we're thinking, okay, well, what are we going to do with those? What would we do with those resources? What would that look like? I think that that creates a really complex situation for districts when they think about how they spend that money and what that would look like. And without a vision for what we want schools to be able to do and achieve, then it can be, that money could be spent in ways that the state or people really don't want that money being allocated towards. I also think that capital improvement plays a large role in that conversation. If a district was able to get additional spending capacity, we know that many districts across the state would use that money to upgrade their facilities. And so if capital improvement is something that we want to see more of, I think that you really need to be strategic with how you're allocating those funds and how you're using those incentives. If the goal is to create schools that are more efficient, then we should be thinking about how we use capital improvement dollars to drive those decisions and make sure that if you're saying, hey, we think that 400 is a good number for a high school, say, okay, that sounds great. Where is the new school that you're going to build in our community that will help improve that quality for kids?
Thanks. Yeah, and you have some recent experience with school consolidations of people coming together, not on their own volition, and then having to separate again.
We do. And I can tell you that a lot of time and energy went into that process. And the student experience really didn't change at all. Right. And what happened is the leadership, the business office, the school boards, everyone was focused on consolidation and changing accounts and governance structure and websites and emails and all these other things. And all that time and energy was taken away from focusing on teaching and learning. And that's what I'm really trying to emphasize, is that if we really want to improve the quality of education in our state, we got to think about where we're spending our time and where we're spending our energy.
Thank you.
I'd say one thing, I want to thank you for saying that, because that's the first time we've heard that in this committee, and that's a really important point. We have put our schools through constant churn, and that's a cost. We don't talk about the cost of policy churn, and that goes back to what we were saying yesterday. If we're making big changes, it needs to be really clear what they are, and we need to not be changing what we're asking for every 2 years, because it is creating administrative burnout. And it is eroding the focus on improving teaching, which is where we need to be focused right now. So thank you for saying that on the record.
I appreciate that. And I think that's like, if I would leave you with one point, it would be, let's fix the funding formula and then we can tackle governance.
Thank you. Not sure we can do all that.
Chicken egg.
I wish, that's what we're worried about.
Yeah.
You have a question?
It's a comment to which there's probably going to be a response. And I think I'll try to keep it right.
Look at Mickey's hand.
I have to run, I'm sorry.
I appreciate you saying we should focus on what we want schools to do and achieve, or where you said, as in contrast to the governor's approach, which seems to be the opposite. What you and Rep. Holcomb were talking about just recently is more, are we talking about consolidation in big bold letters, or are we talking about rearranging the parts that we have here, make more effective use of that? And I just sort of leave that as two different approaches, like the governor's approach versus what you're saying. And I'll continue to revert back to my earlier question when a previous witness of who's going to make these decisions and how do we get there? And I don't think we keep pecking away at that, and I don't think we know that it troubles me. I understand it's a big and it's a difficult question, but Zoe Saunders keeps reverting in testimony that we've heard over and over again. She goes back to scale, and her version of scale seems to support quite directly what she and the governor are proposing, and not what this conversation has been about this morning. And you can comment if you want, or you could say, I don't know, I'll put it in, email or something. But we get closer and closer to the fundamental questions here, but we still have a ways to go. My 10 cents. Thank you for listening.
So committee, we have a very busy afternoon. Be here on time. We're going to start at 1 o'clock.
Thank you.
We're going to be here, not on the floor.
Thank you.
Brian, thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you very much. Definitely.
Carolyn,